So now I want to get into I think it's interesting. I like that we've laid this groundwork because I think a lot of people watching who are even libertarian and view themselves as the ultimate anti-Marxists agree with a lot of the things that you're saying. So we have some common ground on things that we agree and don't agree, the things that we agree on. So let's get into what we don't agree on. So what do you think has been what would be the difference between this MAGA communism that you're First of all, let me just ask you a basic question. Do you think the government should shift and that this should be a government instilled ideology for all of us, or are you a proponent of no, this is just something you want in your individual community that you create?
Well, look, all MAGA communism is about is creating a movement for, by, and of the working class, and to create political demands that are centered around the interests of it's the working class. So it's a perspective very much rooted in one of class struggle. The idea that the working class's interests are different from the interests of the elites. And typically we say, well, what do we want to do that's going to be for America in general? But there's a conflict of interest that I think a lot of people are missing. There's some things that are good for Wall Street, such as the policies of the Federal Reserve. Those are very good for Wall Street and for the monopolists. And I think even libertarians and communists can see eye to eye on the fact that we don't live in a free market capitalist country in the sense of classical liberalism. We live in an oligarchical, monopolistic, dictatorship of a few cartels and banksters who basically rigged the economy entirely to their interests. Now, as far as ideology is concerned, I think everyone's free to have whatever ideology they want. I think everyone's allowed to have whatever personal philosophy that they want. And I think a good country is one that optimizes and maximizes the extent to which people are allowed to experiment with that in ways that aren't socially destructive. Communism isn't really necessarily even an ideology, it's more a specific way of elevating the common interest to the supreme status by recognizing the fact of this conflict of interest at the heart of society, recognizing the fact that simultaneously we do have this common shared history and this common reality, which we need to take as a whole, as its entirety, not just one sidedly. We need to have a perspective that reflects the interests of all of the American people, not just the capitalist class and not just the kind of coastal elites and the kind of urban liberal technocrats and experts.
Okay,
So I
so
would say that, I
go
would say
ahead.
that the ideology is not necessarily a strong point of emphasis.
Okay, has there been a communist country in history that you would say is the closest to what you're envisioning?
Well, communism is always different in whatever country it's applied to or it exists in because they have different common realities. So the Soviet Union was addressing the reality of the former Russian Empire. The Chinese communism is addressing the reality of China. The Vietnamese communism is addressing the reality of Vietnam. So in American communism, we'll have to address the reality of America. Now, what all of those countries have in common is just the fact that they have these governments in these states which are responsive to and which recognize the supremacy of the people's interest over profit, the common interest over the private interest. But as far as the details of that and exactly what that looks like, there's a huge degree of variability.
Mhm.
China, very different from the Soviet Union today, right? It's extreme degree of variability in terms of the systems and the details that are in place, which I think a lot of people can already observe. China doesn't have the Soviet style directly top down planned economy. It has a huge role of markets and integration with the international market, which not a lot of people associate with communism.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't look at China and view it as or even Vietnam today and view it as as communist countries. These are countries that have, in my view, a lot of capitalism that have been infused into them in order for them to now be prosperous. And so I think my biggest critique of communism just from the beginning, I have a lot, but my first critique would be that countries flourish under capitalism. Capitalism has been able to now, I don't like the crony capitalism. I completely agree with you. What we are living under right now is not real capitalism. But if we were to have a system of true capitalism, then it does elevate people out of poverty very quickly. There's a lot of innovation. There's motivation for that innovation, And it seems to, the rising tide rises all the boats. So even though there is a discrepancy between the wealthy in this society and the poor in this society, the poor in this society are still not as poor as the poor in other societies.
I think that's true for the United States and also for Europe, but I also think we're also dealing with a developmental difference. The Industrial Revolution started in England, it spread throughout Europe, it went to America. The rest of the world was colonized. So there's this lag, this developmental lag that's always been there. And we have to ask the question, which countries have been able to overcome this developmental lag the most effectively without having to rely on foreign loans and without having to give up their sovereignty? And I think the answer is clear. The Soviet Union, it completely super industrializes in 10 years. China's rapid industrialization, I don't think it's ever been seen on the scale that it's been at in the history of all of humanity. And we like to think that China simply adopted capitalism. There's even some Trotskyists that claim the Soviet Union was capitalist, right?
Hmm.
But it stems from a false view of what communism actually is. When you integrate markets in a specific and meticulous way, such as that they produce an outcome which is commensurate with the interests of the overwhelming majority of your people, that's not capitalism. Because what counts in capitalism isn't necessarily the presence of markets or the presence of profits, but whether markets and profits are in command, whether those dominate and define the entirety of society in the last instance. China can use a lot of the things we associate with capitalism to ultimately produce a communistic outcome, and I think that's precisely, even Marx talks about that. If you read the Communist Manifesto, the 10 planks don't immediately call for the elimination of all aspects of capitalistic society. The transition into a society which is going to be devoid of markets and devoid of all these kind of things, which is kind of maybe entering into that already in the age of AI, perhaps, but that's a little speculative. That's going to take time. That's not going to happen at the level of political will. Now, it needs to be stressed. The theory of communism, because it's also a theory, isn't about here's my ideal society. I want to create policies around producing the society exactly I want to see. It's a scientific understanding of how different societies evolve. You had the feudal society in the Middle Ages, which evolves into capitalism. And the idea is that eventually capitalism is going to evolve into socialism or into communism. And I think the main problem that a communist would have with the current political arrangement, the main critique would be we seem to be transitioning into a more socialistic society that's more integrated, that seems to be more centralized, that seems to have more of a role of information as opposed to markets. And markets even seem to be relegated to the status of information signaling devices, right? But at all of the prosperity and all of the fruit of the society is being accumulated privately instead of being distributed by the people actually producing it. I mean, we are. I mean, America is not a classical liberal capitalist society anymore.
Right.
We are so centralized. The society is so meticulously planned by the Federal Reserve and by God knows what else, to a point where you could say we have a socialism for the rich right now. It's like the foundation for this new era of humanity is here, but none of the outcomes are being reaped in a way that benefits the majority of people. It's
Hmm.
like it's a socialism for the capitalists.
Okay. Would we own anything? Can I own
Absolutely.
private property?
Absolutely. The critique of private property has never been about being able to own things. It's been about, for example, the institution of money, private property, which is no use value to people. It has no use to people. It's not being put to work in any kind of way, dominating dominating our economic life, dominating our society and our country. So to give you an example, traditionally in Marxism, if you own a home, it's not really private property because the home, the property of the home, reflects you in a way. You're the one who's using it in a specific way that gives purpose and meaning to it. But when you look at, for example, the interest rates of a certain bank or something, that's private property because it doesn't serve any purpose except to just make more profit for profit's sake. So people should bear that distinction in mind. Owning things is great. When humans own things, they give purpose, meaning, and meaning to them, and they use them in a specific way. But when you're a landlord, for example, who just owns a bunch of properties somewhere, a bunch of homes that aren't no one's living in, and you're just using it to speculate to turn a profit, that would be more like an example of private property. But even when you're an entrepreneur and you have a business, and your goal is, I want to sell, let's say, I want to sell the best burgers in town. I want to make the best burgers. You're committed to a specific vision. That's not, and profit can be integrated in that, sure, but you're not just doing it for money, right? You're doing it because of your love for making food. So there's even a framework in which entrepreneurship and businesses can exist under a communist state, as they do in China. The problem is when profit is elevated at the expense of all else, elevated to the supreme status, which is what we saw in the aftermath of, for example, 2008, where because of some because of the profit mongering interests of banks, people were kicked out of their homes, kicked out into the street, lost their
Mhm.
jobs, lost their
Right.
livelihoods.
So when you say eliminate, so you would want to eliminate a form of property, but that form of property would be this sort of speculative investment property that isn't actually tangible. So you can own tangible property, but you can't own like stocks or I mean, is that or like the banks would you would want to eliminate interest rates?
Not necessarily, but eliminate interest rates that are not conducive to any productive outcome. China has interest rates with regard to its public infrastructure and credit investment banks, but those are for a productive outcome. It ultimately produces things like trains and bridges and infrastructure. So there needs to be an outcome somewhere along the road. But if it's just a hoarding money for money's own sake, while the rest of society is decaying, I think you have an inherently broken system.
So you could invest, so you could have a stock market, I suppose. You could invest in companies as long as the company is that investment is like a tangible investment that is being used for some purpose.
Yeah, that would be a communistic policy, and then we can speculate that eventually there probably won't be any need for stock markets anymore because technology, for example, would have rendered it unnecessary. And it's not that communists want to impose that outcome right off the bat, but in the meantime, we want to have policies and make decisions that suit the interests of the people and the country instead of just this, this Moloch, which is just money for money's own sake.
But some people can't maybe produce on their own for whatever reason, right? They're disabled, they don't have any skills, or stupid. I mean, whatever reason, they just can't produce on their own. And the ability for them to have investments, the ability for them to become a landowner and rent homes out to people allows them, affords them income. Would you want to eliminate that?
Well, I think when it comes to people who have disabilities, one way or another, who cannot contribute or work for society, I think every civilized country believes that if these people don't have family members that could take care of them, that's another strong point of emphasis I'd like to make. It is the responsibility of society, one way or another. I don't care if it's at the most local of possible levels, because I know not a lot of people are fans of the welfare state, but society has an obligation to take care of those vulnerable people who literally have no ability to take care of themselves. But at the same time, I mean, usually families are able to take care of disabled members. And one of the problems with destroying family values is you're basically severing the organic bonds that people have, which are, I mean, they're fundamentally important for any economy and for any people. I mean, one of the reasons in China you don't really have a huge, widespread problem of homelessness is because ultimately people have families they can go back to. People
Mhm.
come from somewhere, right? This idea of someone being completely estranged and isolated, having no family connections whatsoever, no community whatsoever. I think that's something at a cultural level that also needs to be addressed. And we should also think about how capitalistic society has destroyed these sacred connections between people, commoditizing our relationships, doing the best to separate us, even in terms of our places of living. If you look at the way that suburban urban planning has been developed, it's basically to kind of do as much as it can to sever the organic bonds of community, where people are
Mhm.
just kind of living in these bubbles, separate and apart from each other.
Well, I mean, I guess to kind of put that in a more to make it really clear, in the United States, we do have a culture of you become an adult, you move out of your parents' home, you get your own place, and then that cycle continues. Your kids grow up, and then they become adults, and they move out, and they get their own place. And in Asian culture, it's not quite like that. In a lot of cultures, not just Asian culture, it's not like that. Where
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
um,
even in Europe, I don't think it's
Fully
it's
like that,
as
yeah, it's
extreme.
generational homes.
Yeah.
In my culture, on my Vietnamese side, it's very common for the grandparents to watch the children while the parents who are of working age go work. So all 3 generations live in the same home because the caretaking is being done by the elderly who are not working anymore, and they have the ability to nurture and care for the children all day while the
Well,
parents go off and work. We don't see
believe
that
it
here
or
in the United States as much anymore.
yeah, believe it or not, that it used to be the case for Americans too. Before, let's say, the 1970s, at least, right?
Yeah,
It used to be, and especially before the 1940s, 1950s, used to be extremely widespread for Americans to have extended families that they live with, and communities, and
right.
so on and so on. I think this notion that Americans, prefer to be isolated isn't necessarily entirely grounded in reality. I think in a lot of ways, we've been forcibly isolated from each other because of the ways urban planning and government policies surrounding the construction of infrastructure and so on have really been tailored to the interests of corporations and private interests, which didn't really take into account what the American people wanted.
Yeah. Well, and I also think it's why we don't live as long as Asians, because
Yeah,
loneliness, being older, living on your own, and then we put people in nursing homes and
right.
rather than with their families, and it's just not healthy. You're not moving around as much. You're sitting there depressed. You're lonely. You're isolated. It's just not healthy. It's just not a healthy way to live in your older age. Okay, what about like intellectual property? Is there with patents and inventing things? This is one of the beefs about communism is that there would be sort of this elimination of intellectual property.
Yeah, surprising. There's a lot of libertarians who are also on board with this, because what intellectual property does is it creates in our my view at least, an unjust monopoly. If you are creating unique works of art or unique inventions, I think that if people want to see you produce more of those, that they can patronize you to do it. This is how I make my income, at least as a content creator. I don't have to put any patents on what I do, because the only thing I'm worried about is like people falsely attributing things to me, like, so that I have to take responsibility for things I didn't say. I mean, that's more of a question of reputation. But when it comes to like how my content gets monetized, for example, if people want to see me continue to put out content, they donate to me. They find a way for me to be patronized. So I think it's kind of wrong to say that if people aren't, if they don't have this monopoly on an idea, this intangible, I mean, it's kind of crazy, this idea that you can own an idea or you can own an image or something in your imagination. I just kind of think there's something about that that's inherently unnatural. And I also think it's wrong to say that there's no way people would have an incentive to do these things because they won't have patents. I think if people see there's merit to your work, they're going to find ways to make sure you can continue doing it. And if there's no demand for your work, your unique ideas, I mean, what entitles you to society's resources in the first place? I think,
Mhm.
and also another thing is, it's like we have to think about what's in the interest of the majority of people, right? Um, because we shouldn't be putting the interests of content creators like myself ahead of steel workers or coal miners. At the end of the day, people who make a living like myself, are always going to be a small minority of society, a very very tiny minority. Whereas people who like work with their hands, actually like do real work, right? Those are the people who actually are the foundation of society and are the reason I'm able to have the free time to do what I do in the first place. If nobody was building homes, and if nobody was attending to paving the roads and putting up internet infrastructure with their hands, I couldn't even go on the internet and say anything. So I also think that the benefit, of course, content creators may be less rich, maybe less wealthy, right? But the benefit to the majority of people, which is allowing them to explore their creative abilities in ways that aren't restricted, right? by these monopolies is just much better.
Hmm. Well, I mean, nobody wants to live in a society where everybody's just building things and nobody's enjoying anything, right? So, I mean, we can't have a society of just coal miners and
Yeah,
and
I agree, but at the same time, it's like the majority of people in a given society are not going to be great geniuses and artists and
right,
whatever. And
right.
I think there's nothing wrong with that. I think there is mundane work that needs to be done in any kind of society. And part of what communism is putting the interests, I mean, putting that work, I mean, it's like before you can go out and have fun, you need to get the work done, right?
Yeah.
And of course, nobody just wants to just do that. And that's actually part of why I'm against intellectual property. If you're an ordinary worker and you want to explore your creative abilities and talents and your vision, and you want to be inspired by what others have already done and improve off of it and work on it in new ways, you can't do that when there's a patent system and there's this monopoly on ideas and images. Some of them are ridiculous, by the way. And it's like, um, I recently there was that thing with Disney, which allowed for people to have access to the Mickey Mouse guy. I don't know if you heard about
Yeah,
that,
right.
Steamboat
Yeah.
Willie, and it's like it's
Yeah.
kind of ridiculous that like nobody could. This is like something that's 100 years old. Until now, nobody could creatively explore the concept of Mickey Mouse in ways they see fit. I don't see the logic, the reason in that.